John is different. In the New Testament, we have the Synoptic Gospels, but John is considered to be unique and unlike the other three. It claims to have come from the perspective of an eyewitness, who is called the beloved disciple, and it contains the most unique material of the four Gospels. It has the most explicit instances of Jesus stating that he is God. It lacks parables, which Jesus employed throughout the Synoptics, and it has Jesus giving long discourses. There are also miracles in John that are not found anywhere in the Synoptics. Additionally, it is well known that John was written last, and most likely between 90 and 100 AD. Because of these factors, many skeptics argue John is mythical or a late, unreliable account. It may claim to have come from the beloved disciple, but this is probably not true. However, this conclusion overlooks a lot of important data. Within the Gospel of John, there are indications we are dealing with a reliable source. Despite what many today say, there is an abundance of evidence to support the conclusion that John is in fact an eyewitness account. As we noted in the videos on the Synoptics, this is one video in a series on the reliability of the Gospels. Many objections that could be raised against the arguments we present here were addressed in earlier videos. But what evidence is there to support the theory that John wrote the Gospel attributed to him? First, the unanimous attestation of the early church fathers is that John wrote the Gospel attributed to him. P66 dates to around 200 AD and is a nearly complete Codex of John. The title on it says it's the Gospel of John. Around the same time, Irenaeus says that after the Synoptics were written, John the disciple of the Lord, who had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Tertullian, Origen, and Clement of Alexandria also attest that John wrote the gospel. Theophilus of Antioch also attributes it to John. Heracleon commented that John 1:18 was spoken not by the Baptist, but by the disciple. Since the Baptist is a reference to John the Baptist, the implication is the disciple also bore the same name, and Heracleon distinguished them by their titles. Irenaeus quoted a Valentinian heretic named Ptolemy, who references phrases we find in the fourth Gospel and attributes them to John. The Gnostic document, the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles, takes a scene from John 13, where Peter asks the beloved disciple to ask Jesus something, and substitutes this title for the name John. The Gospel of John says the author is the beloved disciple, so the implication is that the author of this Gnostic work agreed the author of the Gospel was John by identifying him as the beloved disciple. Around 190 AD, Polycrates of Ephesus wrote a letter where he identifies the beloved disciple as John. The anti-Marcionite prologue says the Gospel of John was revealed and given to the churches by John while still in the body, just as Papias of Hierapolis, the close disciple of John, related in the Exoterics, that is, in the last 5 books. Indeed, he wrote down the Gospel while John was dictating carefully. The Muratorian fragment says, the fourth Gospel is that of John, one of the disciples. When his fellow disciples and bishops entreated him, he said, "Fast ye now with me for the space of 3 days, and let us recount to each other whatever may be revealed to each of us." On the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should narrate all things in his own name, as they called them to mind. So the external evidence all points to the author being John, a disciple of Jesus. But scholars today note there are many candidates as to who this John was. Some say it was John the son of Zebedee, others say John Mark, or a disciple called John the Elder, whom Papias mentions. This second and third candidate could also be the same person. But this is irrelevant to the point that is being made. Regardless of which John it was, the external evidence unanimously agrees the author was a disciple and eyewitness of Jesus, who was named John. Additionally, the internal evidence of the Gospel also supports this conclusion. The first thing to note is the author directly claims to be an eyewitness. He records that the beloved disciple has witnessed these events. and in the last chapter, we read he is the one who has written these things. Additionally, the first epistle of John was most likely written by the same author, and he states he was an eyewitness of Jesus. The charitable position to take when it comes to a claim like this is to judge the author innocent unless proven guilty. As Paul Ricker said, the prudent role is, first, trust the words of others, then doubt if there are any good reasons for doing so. The author appears to be someone who valued the importance of eyewitness testimony and passed on his first-hand knowledge, not someone who was collecting hearsay. Leon Morris said, "When then it is claimed that the author of the fourth gospel is a witness, and when we have definite appeal to the testimony of an eyewitness in his gospel, this should not be understood as an isolated thing. The writers of the New Testament valued the testimony of eyewitnesses. We should not treat them as though they were interested only in edification and were prepared to manufacture statements and incidents which they felt must have happened. Again and again they appeal to the fact that they are bearing witness to what they have seen." The author seems set on reminding us his testimony is reliable because he witnessed what he wrote about. Colin Hemmer lists 8 elements of a reliable historian that were acknowledged in antiquity. Not all of them were employed by every historian, but Craig Blomberg notes 6 of them are employed in John's Gospel: eyewitness participation, eyewitness interview, limiting coverage to material to which the writer had privileged access, the prospect of checking details with contemporary documents, the use of sources for speeches, and the vigor of the concept of truth in history as it actually happened. Thus, John seems to be writing in a way to inform the audience of his day that his information is accurate eyewitness testimony. He is not intending to write a work of fiction, as we see with the style of the later heretical Gospels. Some have argued the beloved disciple is only a literary device, meant to represent the Christian community at large, or as a model for believers. Additionally, the beloved disciple is written about in third person and not in first person. But this hypothesis doesn't fit with the narrative. Jonathan Bernier notes the beloved disciple interacts with Jesus and Peter. He is not some outside watcher, but a real person in the narrative. It is difficult to imagine that John wants us to construe Jesus and Peter as non-historical symbolic figures. What warrant, then, is there to suppose that John wants us to place the beloved disciple in an ontological category distinct from other characters in the narrative? Also, it was common for ancient writers to refer to themselves in third person, so this is not remotely an issue. Some argue the beloved disciple cannot be the author because John 21:24 says, "We know that his testimony is true," which suggests more than one person was writing. But this would not necessarily exclude the beloved disciple, since the verse also says he is the one who has written these things. If we recall what the Muratorian fragment reports, it said there were others with John when he wrote, including the disciple Andrew. The "we" could simply be the others the Muratorian fragment mentions. Interestingly enough, in line with this, the Gospel of John introduces Andrew, even before Peter, along with an unnamed disciple, who is most likely the beloved disciple. After all, why should this anonymous disciple have primacy alongside Andrew and not be someone of significance? So John appears to open by introducing himself and Andrew, the 2 main disciples the Muratorian fragment says were present when the Gospel was composed. Richard Bauckham, however, takes a different approach and notes that ancient writers often slip from first-person singular to first-person plural when speaking of themselves. In the conclusion of one of his works, Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote, "I would have given you examples of what I have said, but for the risk of becoming a bore, especially as it is you that I am addressing. That is all we have to say about the style of Demosthenes. My dear Emmaus, if God preserves us, we shall present you in a subsequent treatise with an even longer and more remarkable account than this of his genius in the treatment of subject matter." Additionally, in John's first epistle, we see he switches back and forth between plural and singular pronouns. So the use of "we" in John 21 doesn't at all point away from the belief that the author identifies himself as the beloved disciple and the one who witnessed the events he has written about. Of course, the obvious response to this is how do we know the gospel was not written by someone lying or pretending to be an eyewitness? Well, we actually have someone who attests to John being an eyewitness, the Gospel of Luke. Luke Vandeweghe and Paul Anderson highlight an interesting phenomenon. When we compare the differences among the Synoptics and the places Luke differs from Matthew and Mark, it surprisingly often agrees with details we find in John, which suggests some form of a relationship. In 1963, Pearson Parker suggested the reason for this was because there was direct contact between the two authors. But Luke Vandeweghe adds, first, commonalities between the Gospels of Luke and John are more substantial and more significantly patterned than Parker suggested, indicating a consistent preference by Luke for Johannine material over Markan material. Second, the Johannine material, favored by Luke, aligns with events in the fourth Gospel, allegedly experienced by the beloved disciple. In other words, not only do Luke and John show considerable agreement, but they do so around material that would have involved the beloved disciple and his direct presence. Both Gospels share a focus on women, like Mary and Martha, and the mother of Jesus. Both share a similar focus on Jerusalem, Samaria, the temple, and the ministry of John the Baptist. Both refer to the importance of relying on eyewitnesses from the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Both tell us Satan entered Judas, that Peter said he would die for Christ, and that Jesus replied by predicting Peter would deny him in the upper room. They also speak of Peter's restoration. Both specify that the ear that Peter cut off was the right ear, and that Jesus frequently visited the Garden of Gethsemane. Both record Pilate's threefold declaration of Jesus' innocence, and place Jesus' scourging and mocking before the death sentence. In the story of John the Baptist, both draw attention to his name, indicate a divine commission, provide more teachings from him than what we find in Matthew or Mark, and both have statements that show John the Baptist was not the Messiah. Additionally, in the shared synoptic material, Luke consistently makes changes that create agreement with John's gospel in places that involve the beloved disciple. He even omits details that disagree with John. Parker said, the third and fourth gospels side together against the first and second gospels 124 times. Vandeweghe says, if we examine the 19 occasions in which Luke deliberately moves away from Matthean, Mark accounts, whenever a Johannine counterpart is present, 16 of the 19 occur in places that the beloved disciple is implied to be present in the Gospel of John. This correspondence becomes more significant as we consider that the beloved disciple is only implied to be present in approximately 32 of the 879 verses in the fourth Gospel. Lamar Cribbs suggested the reason for the relationship is not because John was dependent on Luke, but because Luke used a Johannine oral tradition that was in existence before John was a written document. This is because there is no evidence of literary dependence between the two. The similarities occur in primitive charismatic portions of traditions, like in the accounts of John the Baptist and the Passion narrative. Parker said, Luke and the fourth evangelist, then, were men of widely different personality and training, and they wrote in complete independence of each other. Yet constantly, they show knowledge of the same traditions, or allude to the same concepts. Oral traditions will account for this, but it must be an oral tradition, much fuller, much more definitive than that which relates John to the other Gospels. There is one way in which the Luke-John relationship could have arisen, and it is difficult to conceive of any other. We must posit two evangelists of quite variant temperaments, working long in the same areas, hearing the same words about their Lord, perhaps participating in the same discussions, then each, remembering these things in his own way and digesting them in his own way, put his record down. In other words, the fourth evangelist must somewhere, sometime, have been associated with Luke in the Christian missionary enterprise. The explanation for the relationship cannot be that John used Luke as a source. It would be odd for John to place himself as the beloved disciple in the very passages he got from Luke, who was known to not be an eyewitness, and then do this nowhere else. The explanation can also not be that Luke used John as a source. As noted, there is no evidence of literary borrowing. We have evidence of literary borrowing from Mark to Luke. So we know what this looks like because Luke used Mark as a source. And we don't see this with John. This would also mean Luke took select portions from John, while leaving out more prominent features, like John's chronology, the long discourses, and the general circumstances of the accounts where John and Luke share aspects. Because of this, the most likely relationship is an oral connection. As Vandewey says, given the strongest correspondence between the Gospels of Luke and John occur in just those portions focusing on eyewitness detail and within the earliest layers of the Gospel proclamation, i.e., those portions that focus on the Baptist, the Passion, and Jesus' resurrection, it is conceivable that Luke acquired these at an early stage through a personal encounter with the beloved disciple. It is, of course, possible that this informant was not the beloved disciple himself, but was a trusted companion who relayed the disciple's testimony to Luke in person. The suggestion that it was the beloved disciple himself, however, seems more plausible. The widespread preference in ancient history writing for living informants versus written accounts could explain why Luke consistently prefers John's versions of accounts to Mark and Matthean counterparts. But given this, and that we have already shown Luke to be a reliable account because of the presence of features like onomastic congruence, confirmed facts, and Semitisms, and that he stated he spoke with eyewitnesses, this would in turn strengthen the case that John is an eyewitness, as he claimed to be. Adding to this, we can see Jesus in John's Gospel is not wholly different from the Jesus in the Synoptics. Throughout the Synoptics, Jesus often spoke in aphorisms. Paul Anderson lists several from John 4 and 12 that align with the character of Jesus that we find in the Synoptics. Just because John reports that Jesus delivered long discourses, that doesn't mean short sayings are missing from John. Anderson also cites Wilbert Francis Howard, who listed 60, and Linda Bridges, who listed 26 in John. We should also not think that just because Jesus spoke in parables and aphorisms, that doesn't mean he never gave long discourses, like what we find in John. As Anderson said, if he were to have held the attention of crowds for hours on end at times, as the feeding narrative in other sections in all four Gospels suggest, he must have delivered longer discourses, as well as short aphorisms. Anderson also lists memorable sayings common to John and Mark. The picture of Jesus in John is not completely different from the Jesus of the Synoptics. They complement one another nicely and share a lot of overlap. Together, they give us a more complete picture of who Jesus was. Anderson argues John is merely focusing on other aspects of Jesus' ministry to supplement the synoptic account. There was no reason to include parables that most people were already familiar with. Despite this, we still see a similar teaching style in John's Gospel. Blomberg says, John certainly knew that Jesus characteristically spoke in metaphors. He uniquely speaks of the paromia of Christ. Kim Dewey translates this term as proverbs and finds no less than 34 of them in the fourth Gospel. Many of these are closely parallel to the imagery used in synoptic parables and aphorisms. Dodd has identified 6 of these passages in John as examples of short narrative parables embedded in larger discourses that even more closely resemble synoptic forms. John also doesn't offer a completely different theology. Instead, he adds details to give us a more complete picture. However, we also see a lack of evidence that John is using Mark as a written source, despite being aware of the synoptic account. The fourth evangelist did not use Mark as a written source, at least not in the ways Matthew and Luke did. Otherwise, there would be at least several identical connections, rather than a broad similarity of some words, themes, and patterns. Conversely, due to the large numbers of Johannine-Markan similarities, contacts probably did exist between the oral renderings of John's and Mark's traditions, and yet, because it is impossible to determine which direction the influence may have gone, the relationship may best be considered one of interfluentiality. It is also unlikely that it only went in one direction between two formative yet independent traditions. Anderson also adds, the fact that none of these contacts are identical makes it implausible to infer that John is dependent on Mark, or that Mark is dependent on the Johannine tradition. John is also more similar to the Synoptics than he is to the later heretical Gospels. He appears to be an independent testimony, not contingent on the Synoptics, and therefore supplements our understanding of Jesus. The question then becomes if there's any reason to trust what John reports and to believe he is an independent eyewitness. Well, we can show John reports details and features in his narrative that form a strong cumulative case that he was in fact an eyewitness. The odds of a later author who didn't have intimate knowledge of Jesus' ministry or the geography obtaining this level of factual information is extremely unlikely. Craig Blomberg wrote an extensive commentary on John and details how he gets fact after fact correct. Paul Anderson and D.A. Carson also list numerous facts that support John's authenticity. In John 1, it says these things took place in Bethany, across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. Anderson notes archaeology has found the presence of a major baptismal site a mile east of the Jordan and confirms the accuracy of this statement. In John 2 it reads, "There were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification." Archaeologists have confirmed such vessels existed in the time period and were most likely used for purification rituals. We should also note that since there was an early Christian tendency to embrace asceticism, the miracle of turning water into wine would be an unlikely late invention and is probably an early tradition that was handed down. Later in John 2, the Jewish leaders report it had taken 46 years to build the temple. Colin Humphreys notes this is an accurate time marker that aligns with when the temple edifice was completed and the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Craig Blomberg notes the teachings of John the Baptist in John 3 are very similar to the theology we found in documents from the Qumran community. Many scholars have suggested the Essenes of Qumran may have had some influence on the theology of John. These sayings are unlikely later inventions and fit with the culture of that time. In chapter 4, John mentions a site called Jacob's Well that existed in Samaria. This has been confirmed by archaeologists. Verse 9 also speaks of hostility between the Jews and Samaritans, something that other texts, like Josephus' Jewish Wars, confirm. Even if one were to assume the conversation with the woman at the well is fiction, verse 22 should be considered reliable because it goes against John's tendency to criticize the official Judaism of Jesus' day. In verse 25, the woman speaks of the coming Messiah. This is also accurate, as the Samaritans were looking for a messianic figure, called the Taheb. Blomberg notes the conversation with the woman doesn't match Jesus' later long speeches, and says it's more likely historical than redactional. Later in John 4, Jesus is said to go down to the region of Galilee, which matches the local topography, as one would be walking down an elevation, which is something a local person would have known. Similarly, in John 5, it says Jesus went up to Jerusalem, which again is correct. Additionally, we would expect a faithful Jew like Jesus to journey to Jerusalem for feasts. Verse 2 says there was a pool called Bethesda with 5 porticos. Archaeology has confirmed this pool existed in Jerusalem, exactly as it is described in John. In verse 17, Jesus says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This is likely an authentic saying, as in the first century, rabbis were discussing how God could constantly work and not violate the Sabbath. Thus, Blomberg notes the language also fits with Jesus' Jewish environment. C.K. Barrett said, John employing in this chapter primitive Christian rather than other terminology, and starting from the well-known fact of Sabbath disputes, hardly does more than develop, with attention to the question of Christology and the phenomenon of unbelieving Judaism, the historical situation to which the work of Jesus gave rise. In John 6:15, the crowd seeks to force Jesus to be king. This is likely an authentic tradition, as it fits with the nationalistic fever of first century Israel, and depicts Jesus as having to run away from crowds instead of controlling them. After this, John says there was a violent storm on the Sea of Galilee, which fits with the known meteorological conditions for that body of water. Porphyry doubted such a storm could occur on such a small body of water, but he was not from the area. A local like John would know such storms did occur on that sea. Jesus' extreme language in this chapter of commanding his followers to eat his flesh and drink his blood is an unlikely invention, since later Christians were accused of cannibalism. It is unlikely they would describe the Eucharist in such extreme language after dealing with such a charge. Petter Borgen also notes verses 31 to 58 fits with a Jewish rhetorical and literary form known as proem midrash. so it fits with the way a rabbi from that time would teach. Since Christians were heavily concerned with winning souls for Christ, it is unlikely they would invent the statement that many turned away from Jesus after this, or that some grumbled at what he said. Later in John 7, we see his brothers were also skeptical of him. Stating this is also an unlikely invention, and so it's probably true that his brothers doubted him during his ministry. After this, we see Jesus is accused of being demon-possessed, which matches the charge of Mark 3:22, and it's also unlikely that later Christians would invent such an insulting charge against their Lord and God. In verses 22 to 23, Jesus speaks of a Jewish custom where a newborn son could be circumcised on the 8th day, even if it was the Sabbath. We see this custom is confirmed in Jewish texts. Leon Morris said this confirms John had knowledge of Jewish customs. In John 7:38, Jesus refers to a scripture verse that is not in the Old Testament. Most likely he is paraphrasing Zechariah and Ezekiel. Blomberg notes this is an unlikely invention. It is unlikely that all this occurred coincidentally in a largely Hellenistic community, rewriting Christian tradition at the end of the 1st century. When the Jewish backgrounds are combined with the obvious awkwardness of having Jesus refer to a scripture that cannot be identified, the case for authenticity appears strong. Moreover, John notes it was the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. During this time, there was an important water-drawing ceremony during this feast. Jesus' analogy would have been appropriate for the time, and therefore is likely historical. It also suggests the author was a Jew familiar with this custom. In John 8, the Jews slandering Jesus by calling him a Samaritan is likely authentic, given the hatred Jews had for Samaritans. That the Jews wanted to stone Jesus for claiming to be God is also probably authentic, given this would have been the expected response. In John 9, it mentions the pool of Siloam, which has been confirmed by archaeology. Later, John reports the Jewish leaders were divided on how to deal with Jesus when he healed on the Sabbath. John does not seem to be simply inventing a unilateral negative response to Jesus, and so it seems like a credible thing that occurred. It also reflects the historical divide between the schools of Shammai and Hillel. The first argued anyone who breaks the Sabbath is a sinner, whereas the latter tended to judge the work that was performed and if it qualified as good or not. So the whole dispute is likely authentic. Jonathan Bernier points out the fear that someone would be put out of the synagogue if they confessed that Jesus is the Christ is likely authentic and a valid way the Jews would have handled followers of Jesus. Additionally, the man that Jesus heals calls Jesus a mere prophet. This is likely authentic, as a later Christian would probably have put a more lofty title in his mouth. Blomberg says, the entire chapter makes sense in an early 1st century Palestinian Jewish framework, yet clearly promotes the Johannine and Christian agenda of belief in Jesus. In John it says, at that time the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. John is correct, this feast occurs in winter, but also east winds would sweep into Jerusalem, which made it much colder. Solomon's colonnade would have shielded these east winds. And so it makes perfect sense for Jesus to be here when it was winter. This is something an eyewitness would accurately depict. Likewise, in John 11, it says Bethany was 15 stadia from Jerusalem, which is the exact distance between the two places, and a native to that region would have known this. John also reports that many Jews had come to console Mary and Martha because of Lazarus' death. This fits with the ancient Jewish custom of entire villages turning up to mourn a death. Also, the description of the wrappings fits with Jewish burial practices. John then depicts the Sanhedrin as comprised of Sadducees and Pharisees, which is historically accurate. Caiaphas was also the high priest that year. Having allies such as Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea can also account for how the disciples found out about what was said during this meeting. John then reports Jesus retreated to a small town called Ephraim. John does not indicate the village or its name had any symbolic meaning, and a later writer in Ephesus would hardly have known about some obscure village, so this tradition is likely authentic. We also see in verse 55 the Jews purified themselves before Passover, which is also an accurate depiction. In John 12, Jesus is anointed with oil, which was something performed for special guests in the ancient world. Anderson says, John also contains several details implying first-hand knowledge of the event. An empirical reference is made to the smell of the perfume filling the room, and statements are made about perceptions, wrong ones, of Judas's intentions and actions. The particulars of the woman performing the anointing are known to the narrator. The Johannine presentation of the anointing of Jesus bears a remarkable degree of historical plausibility, as compared to alternative presentations. Derek Tovey said, "At every point where the beloved disciple appears, the narrative includes items of close detail which suggest on-the-spot eyewitness report." Of the four Gospels, only John reports palm branches were used in the triumphant entry. This fits with the cultural context, as it would harken back to the custom of the Hasmonean dynasty, celebrating military victories and welcoming a king. John 13 reports that Jesus washed the disciples' feet. It was a customary practice in this time for a servant to wash the feet of all the guests. The story of Jesus performing this task is an unlikely invention, given how degrading this would have looked. And Peter insisting that Jesus wash his whole body fits with the impulsive nature of Peter we find in the other Gospels. John 13:24 says Peter motioned to the beloved disciple to ask Jesus a question. A fiction writer could have just had Peter ask Jesus directly, but at an actual gathering like this, people would be talking over one another. Peter needing to motion to John to ask Jesus a question would make more sense if this was a real event that took place. In the farewell discourse, Jesus uses a metaphor of a woman giving birth, which is thoroughly Jewish and fits with the cultural context. Barnabas Linders finds a parallel in a Qumran text. He said, "There is no reason to doubt that Jesus could have used this imagery in a similar way to express the arrival of the new age." Jesus ends this discourse with a prayer and looking up to heaven. Blomberg notes this was the standard Jewish way to pray, and ending such a discourse with a prayer has numerous Jewish parallels. John 17:2 contains Semitisms, which suggest an Aramaic original that likely goes back to the historical Jesus. Regarding the chapter, Blomberg argues it seems to be historical. It seems far more likely that this prayer goes back at least to an early Aramaic-speaking Jewish Christian community, thus almost certainly in Palestine, if not the historical Jesus himself. In John 18, he accurately identifies Annas as the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Noting the priest refused to enter the headquarters of Pilate for fear of being ritually unclean fits with standard Jewish concerns regarding purity. The Synoptics do not tell us why the Jews handed Jesus over to the Romans. Only John gives us the reason. Josephus confirms John's account that the Jews had no right to kill someone in this situation and needed the Romans to execute them. Many doubt the custom that resulted in Barabbas being released, but Craig Evans notes we have similar practices in the surrounding world, which makes this custom under Pilate plausible. The soldiers' mockery of Jesus is also historically plausible, as we find something similar in Philo. John 19 says Pilate brought Jesus outside and sat in the judgment seat. Josephus describes a similar arrangement, and excavations have found a similar structure. Raymond Brown notes Pilate saying, "Behold the man," is probably historical. A later Christian would probably have had Pilate say, "Behold the king." Of course, historians note the crucifixion of Jesus is considered to be an indisputable fact, but other facts in John's account are also historical. Josephus notes multilingual notices were often used, so the sign placed above Jesus in multiple languages seems to be reliable. The breaking of crucified victims' legs is also likely historical, given we've discovered the remains of a crucified victim in Judea who had one leg fractured and the other smashed into pieces. But additionally, John reports after Jesus died, blood and water came out of his side. Some have suggested this is mythological, because once the heart stops, the blood would congeal, so blood and water would not pour out of someone dead. Even Origen had to explain this away as a miracle. John even felt the need to interrupt the narrative to assure his audience this was something he witnessed, which suggests the ancient reader would not have believed that blood and water would come out of a dead body. But modern research has revealed this would be a natural result from a victim who suffered severe beatings and blood loss. Shock and blood loss can lead to the body losing its ability to clot blood, which is known as trauma-induced coagulopathy. Additionally, clear fluid would have accumulated in Jesus' lung from multiple beatings. So when the soldier pierced his side, we would expect blood and water to come out because of the type of injuries he suffered. This is most likely historical and something John witnessed, since he felt the need to interrupt the narrative and assure his audience this was something he saw. Only recent medical research has confirmed this would have been a natural result from the severe beatings that Jesus endured, and something the ancient audience did not fully understand. Josephus confirms that spices were used for royal burials, and the Jews used linen cloths to wrap dead bodies. Having Jesus placed in the tomb of a Sanhedrin member is an unlikely invention, since the council was the reason Jesus was condemned to death. After the resurrection, we see John agrees with the Synoptics that the empty tomb was discovered by women. But John reports that Mary exclaimed, "Teacher." Later Christians would probably have used a more lofty title. Moreover, John preserves the Aramaic word she uttered, which suggests this is a reliable tradition he was told. Finally, in John 21, John uses a specific word for cooked fish that no other New Testament author uses. John uses it 5 times throughout his gospel, and John A.T. Robinson noted that this word is a distinctive name for cooked fish, in which the trade would have been conducted. This shows familiarity with the fishing business, which is something we would expect given John 21 indicates the author was familiar with this line of work. John also dispels a rumor that he would live until Jesus' return. He confirms Jesus did not say that and adds his own commentary. However, this shows us he did not think he was free to invent sayings of Jesus. Instead, he tells us what Jesus said and asks to clarify the meaning. A fiction writer could simply have invented a new saying of Jesus to assure that John was not going to live until the second coming. As Blomberg says, hence, the need for clarification proves historically probable as well. Individually, all these points we have listed would not amount to much, but when combined, they make a strong cumulative case that the Gospel of John is historically reliable, and they strongly support the church tradition that the author is John, the beloved disciple and eyewitness of Jesus. And beyond this, there are several other pieces of evidence Blomberg covers in his book that we don't have time to get to. A fiction writer would not have gotten this kind of accuracy or written in this fashion. Given the evidence, it makes more sense to see John as a reliable eyewitness account. As Paul Anderson said, John has more archaeological, topographical, sensory empirical, personal knowledge, and first-hand information than all of the other Gospels combined. Richard Bauckham says, all events in John's Gospel are located, and most are located quite precisely in a named town. As a general feature of the Gospel, its topographical precision is not primarily a matter of symbolism, but of realistic historiography. D.A. Carson said, the verifiable Johannine accuracies ought to be given more weight than is common at present. I'm referring to details of topography and the like. Of course, one may say that John used reliable sources or reliable tradition at these points, and thus remove the credit for accuracy from the evangelist himself. But that simply pushes the argument one step further back. If his sources and/or traditions are so good where they are verifiable, why should they be judged largely suspect where they are not verifiable? Now, some object and point out that the way Jesus sounds in the Gospel of John sounds an awful lot like how John sounds in 1 John. So John must not have stayed true to what Jesus actually taught, and instead wrote in a way to make Jesus sound more like himself. First, it could merely be the case that John is paraphrasing Jesus and using his own style, which is a natural human tendency. This would not mean John is unreliable, or that John wasn't staying true to what Jesus taught, simply because humans naturally word things in their own style. Second, Mike Licona notes it could equally be the case that John's own style of writing was greatly influenced by how Jesus taught, and that he actively tried to mimic Jesus' style. This would be expected, given that we see John as such a high view of Jesus. However, Craig Blomberg notes it's not the case that John and Jesus sound exactly the same. No less than 145 words spoken by Jesus in John appear nowhere in the evangelist's narrative material, and many of these are general enough in meaning that we might have expected them elsewhere. Additionally, as we noted earlier, there is a lot of similarity with the character of Jesus that we find in the Synoptics. Mike Licona and Paul Anderson add that we find similar sayings in John to what we find in the Synoptics. John often reports that Jesus doubled his truly, or amen, but we see that in Luke, Jesus sometimes doubled his wording with other words. Moreover, in the Synoptics, Jesus says he spoke in a different manner to crowds than the way he spoke privately to his close disciples. John records many private conversations Jesus had, whereas the Synoptics focus more on Jesus' public sermons. Jesus was most definitely more than a one-dimensional rabbi, and John is likely recording another side of Jesus to give us a more well-rounded picture of who he is. Therefore, when we look at the data, we see strong indications the Gospel of John does indeed go back to an eyewitness. He of course tells us he was an eyewitness, and there is no reason to doubt this. Luke's Gospel backs this up, since he seems to have relied on John, and he tells us he interviewed eyewitnesses. Then when we go through John, we see a strong cumulative case the author was a reliable authority on the ministry of Jesus. This is on top of all the external evidence that unanimously attests that the author of the fourth Gospel is the disciple John. And beyond this, we still have overwhelming evidence that confirms the reliability of the other Gospels. As stated before, we are not dealing with late legends, but reliable and authoritative accounts that go back to eyewitnesses. The evidence confirms the tradition of John's authorship. John's Gospel is an eyewitness account of the life and teachings of Jesus.